Whether Brexit presents a world of opportunity or a world of pain very much depends on your perspective. For media businesses, there is a patchwork of pros and cons. In this part, we'll look at the areas that are likely to be affected by Brexit. And in part 3, we'll look at where business should continue as normal, although perhaps only on the surface. Firstly, broadcasting and the AVMS.
So there are at least a couple of problems with the European Convention on Transfrontier Television from way back in 1989. The first is that it only applies to linear services. It wasn't designed to regulate on-demand services at all. They're just not mentioned. And this means that if broadcasters end up having to obtain licenses on the basis of the convention, then whilst one license might enable them to provide linear services across the single market, they might have to make multiple notifications or obtain multiple licenses for on-demand services. The second is that some of the content regulations in the convention simply look quite out of date these days.
Even if the UK leaves the EU without a new trade deal, businesses can rely on the European Convention on Transfrontier Television, which in short means that broadcasters will still only require one licence to broadcast across the EU. However, this arrangement is far from perfect. Continuing to have access to other EU countries on the basis of the AVMS is something the UK can only secure by negotiating it into a new trade deal. Given the government seems to have ruled out the EEA or EFTA model, we can't know how any deal will turn out for media service providers. Reverting from the AVMS to the Convention and WTO rules isn't the only headache potentially awaiting media service providers. Phil Sherrill explains.
So the Satellite and Cable Directive creates a very efficient system whereby broadcasters can acquire rights to programming in one territory and automatically be cleared for immediate redistribution across the EU. Now, if we leave the EU and pass an omnibus bill, that might create what we call a reciprocity gap. And what I mean by that is that in the UK, we would continue to recognise EU broadcasts as being cleared here, but the reverse might not apply. The remaining EU states would be able to say that a UK originating broadcast no longer benefited from the Satellite and Cable Directive, and so separate clearance had to be sought.
And it's not just these laws from 1989 or 1993 that are problematic. There are some very current examples.
The EU's proposed content portability regulations are designed to ensure that EU customers can access their digital subscription services, such as Netflix, whilst travelling in other EU countries. Given the likely timing of Brexit, the regulations will have been part of UK law for some time before the UK leaves the EU. This will be a real headache for media service operators, consumers and rights holders. When the UK leaves the EU, the regulations will no longer apply, and this means that British consumers will no longer be legally entitled to access their subscription services whilst they're abroad in EU countries.
In fact, evolution of laws under the Digital Single Market Strategy is going to create a real puzzle for UK media businesses over the next few years. One challenge is trying to work out how much to invest to ensure compliance. For example, complying with the portability rules isn't expected to be cheap. Changes driven by this digital single market strategy aren't the only ones that media businesses are going to have to conjure with over the next few years. And perhaps in some instances, Brexit will offer scope for stability or creation of a distinctive regime.
Copyright is an area of law where harmonisation is patchy. A number of EU rules over the last few years have gone some way to making things more consistent. However, local member states still have quite different local laws. For example, in the UK, there's a closed list of works that can be protected. Artistic works, literary works, musical works, and so on. Whereas in France, in principle, anything can qualify provided it's original. Given this, copyright is an area of law where the UK has a really good opportunity to make things different if it wants to.
So where might the UK depart from EU principles?
So a couple of years ago, the UK tried to introduce a private copying exception into English law. but that was ultimately struck down for not being compliant with the EU law in the Information Society Directive. The particular point of principle was that the private copying exception didn't also provide for compensation to rights holders whose works were going to be copied under the exception, and the court held that didn't comply with EU law. So one can see that going forward there will be a temptation for the government to come back to that issue and try to reintroduce the private copying exception on the basis that it no longer has to comply with the Information Society Directive principles around compensation.
And then, of course, there's the arch enemy of the UK's news publishing industry, the European Convention on Human Rights. What does Brexit mean for this journalist punchbag?
The European Convention of Human Rights isn't EU-made law, but being a signatory to that convention is associated with membership of the EU. In addition, the European Commission has issued its own Charter of Human Rights, which is part of EU membership. Theresa May, the UK's Prime Minister, has made no secret of the fact that she would quite like to introduce a new British Bill of Rights, which would be completely separate from the ECHR. This is an idea that's actually been bandied around by governments over many years, but whilst we've been a member of the EU, it hasn't been possible. Once we Brexit, that of course becomes entirely possible. What that would do potentially is give the English courts an opportunity to revisit the debate surrounding the availability of celebrity privacy injunctions in the UK, which in the past have been granted based largely on Article 8 of the European Convention. Remedies for the removal of personal stories from the internet are also currently found in European data protection legislation. One example of this is the now very well-known right to be forgotten. Whilst we're likely to preserve most of the European data protection standards when we Brexit, there will now be an opportunity for the UK courts to go their own way in terms of the lengths they're prepared to go to protect personal data used online.
The law which enables celebrities to obtain privacy injunctions won't disappear the moment the UK leaves the EU, because it would have to be specifically abolished. But along with a few others, perhaps this is one of the unexpected upsides or downsides of Brexit, depending on who you are.
So another area where we can see different parts of industry trying to pull UK law in different directions post-Brexit is around intermediary liability. This has been one of the hottest topics in the digital single market debate over the last couple of years, and it's about whether content owners should have greater ability to stop internet intermediaries hosting content without permission. Freed from the e-commerce directive and the hosting defence, we think the UK content community will be seeking to push UK law in a direction whereby they have greater rights against services like YouTube. Equally, the US internet community will clearly be seeking to push UK law more in the direction of US law, where they have much greater protection from liability.
But perhaps all these potential areas for disruption and innovation pale into insignificance when compared with the elephant in the room, employment and immigration law.
It's a tale of two halves, really. We don't think that the basic employment law rules are going to change much once Brexit occurs. Immigration, however, is an entirely different matter. We know that the free movement of persons is a big issue on the government's agenda and that the immigration rules are likely to change, but we don't yet know how. However, there are steps that employers can be taking in the meantime. We'd recommend that you carry out an immigration audit. What that means is looking at UK nationals that are working in the EU and vice versa, and working out whether there's any scope to apply either for dual citizenship or permanent residency.
In reality, no one knows yet how this will turn out. In part 3, instead of looking at some of the areas of change, we'll look at some of the areas where being stuck with the status quo might be less dramatic and less liberating than some might be expecting.